that I'm going to give today is on the use of antibiotics in the ICU. This is going to be dominantly directed at the principles behind the use, not at any specific antibiotic or any specific infection in the ICU. So if you really realize it, it is extremely common for people to develop an infection in the ICU or come to the ICU with an infection. So to approximately say roughly half the number of patients in the ICU are probably infected or will develop an infection at some time or the other. And these infections obviously can be of varying types, but there is a dominance of respiratory and bacteremic infections that you will see in the intensive care patient. When we use antibiotics under these circumstances, there are certain very basic rules that we need to apply in the use of these antibiotics. We give antibiotics in patients at various stages of infection, or even at stages where we would suspect the development of infection. When we anticipate an infection, we can administer a prophylactic antibiotic even before the infection has developed. Very often in the ICU, we typically would use antibiotics in patients with clinically suspected infections who have not yet had a proof by bacteriological confirmation of the existence of the infection. And this is what we would constitute empirical therapy. And the third situation is when we have a bacteriological confirmation and the patient is identified to have a specific infection, and we would treat them definitively. With these three major circumstances, we need to develop basic rules about the use of antibiotics in each of these situations. The situation in which prophylaxis has probably been well studied is in the situation related to infections in surgery. And here, we know the rules. Long ago, in 1960s, we developed rules related to the use of prophylactic antibiotics, where the existence of a reasonable concentration of antibiotic at the time of incision would be the most effective way of preventing an infection. A single dose given 1 hour before incision is very typical of what is usually recommended, and this is only for what we call as clean contaminated surgery, surgery with a reasonable risk of developing infection. The same principle is usually extrapolated, but before we extrapolate it, I want to make one very specific point. While it is very typical for us to say 1 dose, it is very common in the surgical setting to prolong the use of antibiotics beyond that, usually for 24 to 48 hours beyond the initial period after the surgery. Now, while this is not associated with any reduction in the rates of infection as is demonstrated in this graph, there is very clearly a strong risk for the development of bacterial resistance from this kind of overuse. So I think we need to be very clear that when we are using an antibiotic in a prophylactic manner, that it also has to be very strictly limited to the point at which the infection is likely to occur. In the ICU, we extrapolate it beyond this and say, can we use this to prevent infections related to the commonest three sources, which is the urinary tract, the respiratory tract, and bacteremia from a catheter-related infection. And in each of these situations, we need to understand that the principles behind this are not very clearly established. There is one thing that is very clear, is the fact that when we administer an antibiotic, we may, to some extent, postpone the development of an infection in each of these situations, but when an infection does develop, the same problem occurs where there is a very high rate of resistance in the infections that subsequently develop. As it stands right now, given the considerably low rates of infection that we get in association with devices and the fear of resistance developing, the recommendations is very clear that we do not prophylax patients for ventilator-associated pneumonia, bloodstream infections, or for COTI. So the basic principles on prophylaxis will be in this slide, where very clearly in surgical situations, we limit our prophylaxis to a single dose, and in other situations we do not use antibiotics for the prevention of infections. The commonest way in which we use antibiotics in the ICU is going to be clearly related to empirical choices. And here we often justify the fact that a patient in the intensive care unit is reasonably sick, and the administration of an antibiotic before the availability of proof that the patient has an infection makes a lot of rational, it has a certain amount of a rationale. Now, the problem with that kind of a process will be the fact that when we treat patients with a suspected infection, it is extremely likely that we will be subjecting the entire population to excessive overtreatment, because a large number of patients with inflammatory responses that are not infective in etiology will probably also receive antibiotics. So we need to be very clear in establishing our ground rules for the use of empirical antibiotics, and I would suggest that they should meet these criteria. Number one, the infection that is in the ICU should be associated with a significant attributable mortality, and that this mortality should be reduced by the administration of an antibiotic, and that this administration of an antibiotic, if it is early and appropriate, is associated with an improvement in survival. And ultimately, if we're going to be using an antibiotic, we have to guarantee that the adverse effects related to the use of the antibiotics are kept to a minimum. These are the principles on which we build the use of empirical antibiotics. Now, when we talk about attributable mortality in the intensive care unit, we need to understand that we cannot just divide patients with a nosocomial infection and compare them to patients without a nosocomial infection and claim that the difference is related to the nosocomial infection itself, because susceptibility to a nosocomial infection itself is a marker of the severity of illness of the patient and could be the reason why a patient dies. Or in other words, death with an infection need not necessarily be death due to the infection. And to differentiate this is a little difficult. We can't not subject patients to no antibiotic therapy and look at outcomes with and without treatment. But generally what we do is to look at observational cohorts in which patients who develop nosocomial infections are given empirical antibiotics, and then we retrospectively identify if these are appropriate or inappropriate. And if we see a difference between the appropriate and inappropriate, we presume that this is related to the infection itself. Unfortunately, in each of these circumstances, the severity of the illness of the patient would be a common confounder. And we need to have ways in which we need to adjust for this. And most studies will be actually something that is done in a retrospective fashion with a multivariate propensity modeling that will allow us to compensate for all these kinds of variability. Unfortunately, data of that quality is really non-existent. But in general, with the current data that is available, we feel very strongly that there is an attributable mortality or an excess mortality related to an infection, particularly in nosocomial infections of the bloodstream and in ventilator-associated pneumonia. It is probably not true for urinary tract infections. So if I was to justify empirical therapy, I would probably justify it in the first two situations and certainly not recommend it for a patient with a suspected urinary tract infection. Now, again, we need to justify the early administration, and once again, as I said, it is impossible for us to look at treatment and no treatment as a comparison because it is ethically wrong. So again, we look at it in the situation of an appropriate or an inappropriate antibiotic, and we try to see if there is a difference in terms of outcomes. And these studies are typically like the one I will demonstrate over here, the famous study by Luna way back in 1997, where he looked at patients with ventilator-associated pneumonia, and he demonstrated that if they were not given antibiotics, they had a certain mortality, which was reduced by an appropriate antibiotic that was administered. And in situations where an incorrect antibiotic was administered, the outcomes were considerably worse, seeming to imply that appropriateness and the selection of the right antibiotic is relevant. But probably what is more essential in this particular study was the fact that when they changed the antibiotic on the basis of a culture that was retrospectively obtained, they did not affect outcomes. Or in other words, they showed very clearly that if you need to get an appropriate antibiotic in, it should be in the beginning. That changing it later is not associated with any effect on the mortality. So this kind of data seems to imply that you need to get an antibiotic in early and it has to be appropriate, and that we can't be changing it at a later stage. This is substantially supported by large retrospective cohorts The two very classical cohorts that we talk about is the one by Anand Kumar, reported in a period of time between 1989 and 2004. And what he showed very clearly is that every hour of delay after the development of hypotension was associated with a 12% reduction in the probability of survival. This kind of relationship very clearly implies that we need to get the antibiotic in early. Again, this is substantiated by the recent retrospective data from the surviving sepsis cohort, which was published last year in 2014, where about 18,000 odd patients were looked at, and it showed the same kind of a linear relationship over a period of time, where a delay of every hour was associated with a poorer outcome. Now, we can be very nitpicky about this and say, okay, these are all retrospective cohorts. The only prospective cohort that we have was the study, the MShockNet study, which couldn't show this kind of a time differential. But other than that, I think the general consensus will be that we need to administer these antibiotics in an appropriate time-dependent manner if we're going to get any improvement in outcome. Now, when we talk about appropriateness also, it is extremely important to recognize that in a country where there is a widespread occurrence of resistance, that we need to be very clearly, very wide spectrum in the way in which we administer these antibiotics. As an example, the data from the Asian Network on Resistant Pathogens implies that in ventilator-associated pneumonia, the commonest pathogens, Acinetobacter baumannii and Pseudomonas aeruginosa, are dominantly carbapenem resistant under our circumstances. And if you wanted to get an appropriate enough coverage, you probably needed more than more than the standard spectrum in terms of the administration of antibiotic. Okay, all right. Okay. So the problem or the risk that is associated with this is going to be the problem of the development of resistance. We clearly know that when we look at resistance as a function of the usage of the antibiotic, there is a clear linear relationship, and we really need to cut down on the use of antibiotics. So it becomes very essential that a second aspect of empirical therapy is to try and narrow down your spectrum as soon as we get lab confirmation. So when we suspect an infection, we initiate an empirical antibiotic with a wide spectrum. When we have a lab confirmation, we go through a process of de-escalation to narrow down the spectrum to the organism that has been specifically identified. Now, with this as our idea, it seems logical, but we will find that most of us as clinicians find it very difficult to de-escalate antibiotics. As an analysis from two separate papers, it's very clear that our tendency to avoid de-escalation is influenced by a lot by our own biases, especially out of concerns for multi-drug resistant organisms, or even paradoxically, when we don't identify an organism, we try to justify our continuation of an antibiotic. Unfortunately, there is no hard and fast rule by which you can rule out or rule in an infection, that often it is very subjective, the way in which we decide to de-escalate or to continue a specific antibiotic. So again, to summarize the basic rules related to empirical therapy, I could always argue that because there is an associated mortality, that empirical therapy is justified for nosocomial infections in the ICU. The antibiotic patterns will obviously have to be decided by the local patterns, because the width of your spectrum is very clearly influenced by that. And very typically, this is going to be a wide spectrum coverage initially that we need to de-escalate subsequently. As a rule, since this is based on the culture and the de-escalation is also based on a culture, no antibiotic should be started prior to the culture of the appropriate site on a given individual. The Surviving Sepsis Guideline in 2012 sort of reiterates the same points. It doesn't show us that it is in any way any different from what you would have. Now, when it comes to definitive therapy, it would look like it will be a simple process. Now, once we have identified the existence of an infection, it seems logical that we can give an antibiotic that is determined by the sensitivity pattern in that specific organism. But there again, there is a very serious problem, because most typically the sites that we look at, particularly the respiratory tract, have a tendency to be colonized to some extent. And the differentiation between an organism that is a colonizer versus the existence of an infection actually becomes quite difficult. Though we have always recommended that in the role for definitive therapy, that we should be avoiding antibiotics in colonized patients and not treating it unless the infection is clearly established. This is not such an easy process. In the past, we used to believe that if we did quantitative cultures of the secretions, for instance in the respiratory tract, we could identify an infection in contrast to the absence of an infection. But again, current data doesn't seem to show any big advantage to this kind of quantitative culture. And in general, the ability to make a decision whether an infection is genuinely an infection is also limited by the fact that we can never establish with certainty whether the patient has an infection or not. And here again, I'm demonstrating this with a set of data that will identify, that will identify the kind of likelihood ratios. None of these tests are significant enough to guarantee that the patient has an infection. The only test probably is a microbiological culture that will be subsequently obtained, and to some extent that would be the only guide that you will have to definitive therapy. Given the limitations that we have with empirical treatment, with prophylactic treatment, and with the treatment of infections in a definitive way, we need to be very careful about the way in which we continue to use antibiotics. And there are certain basic principles for responsible use that need to be emphasized. These rules will be to say, number one, identify the site of the infection. Number two, know the kind of organism that you're dealing with, which includes knowledge of the appropriate choice of antibiotics, and ultimately maximizing the efficacy of the application by knowing certain basic principles on pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, and making decisions about the duration of therapy under each of these circumstances. So with this in the background, the identification of the site becomes a logical exercise. If we knew the site, it is easy for us to know the organisms and to tailor our antibiotics to those specific organisms. The existence of, say, for instance, Enterococcus in the bloodstream almost virtually rules out the lung as a source, which allows us to make a very clear diagnosis and to focus our antibiotic therapy appropriately. And knowledge of the site is also extremely important because it gives us an idea of the nature of the organisms. And here again, we should be very familiar not only with our local pathology, but also with the circumstances that we face in developing nations. The data from the INICC, for instance, will allow us to manage both ventilator-associated pneumonia, which is very different in the developing world in comparison to what you would see in the Western world, both in terms of bloodstream infection and in terms of the ventilator-associated pneumonia. So knowledge of these organisms genuinely makes a difference in the way in which you will treat these patients. Besides that, knowledge of the resistance patterns in these organisms is also virtually very important. While we might worry in Western populations about concerns about MRSA and VRE, with VRE particularly being a very serious concern, we don't have to worry about that as a primary concern under developing world circumstances. On the other hand, we do worry about the high rates of resistance among gram-negatives, which probably will change the way in which we apply these antibiotics. This is again data that shows you a distinct difference between the patterns of infection and the knowledge that most infections in the developing world are related to Acinetobacter and Pseudomonas, which is very important because we do know, for instance, that the carbapenem resistance patterns in these particular organisms is extremely high. Also, a knowledge of the organisms is important, primarily because we do recognize the problem of extended spectrum beta-lactamases. We do understand that when we deal with extended spectrum beta-lactamases, that there is cross-resistance with not only the beta-lactams, but for instance the quinolones, and as a consequence the selection of our antibiotics will be dictated by these processes. It is also important, for instance, when we see Klebsiella that is resistant to carbapenem, we need not worry about what is typically seen in the Western world, for instance. Our Klebsiella carbapenemase is actually not the typical KPC, but is our own desi threat, the NDM, which seems to be far more relevant. An approach of these to these patients will be dictated by a knowledge of the resistance patterns in these specific threats. And ultimately, no antibiotic choice should be made without a knowledge of your local pathogen patterns, and a routine publication of the antibiograms from your hospital could be a major way in which you can guide your therapy. Ultimately, the application of these antibiotics will also be dependent on a basic understanding of the pharmacokinetic principles in intensive care patients. It is very typical for us to be worried about the renal failure in the intensive care patient and a tendency to underdose a large number of antibiotics, which is completely paradoxical to the pharmacokinetic principles, primarily because most of the intensive care patients have a large volume of distribution, and the initial dosing of the antibiotic should be at an appropriate level, probably even marginally higher than we normally would administer. Subsequent dosing can be tailored to the clearance of these antibiotics, and there it can be very clearly dependent on a knowledge of the patient's renal function and of other clearance mechanisms that are relevant. Okay, very important again is that we do not carefully assess the clearance mechanisms, particularly related to the renal failure. And we have to recognize that the rules that we use, for instance, of the Cockcroft-Gault formula, was something that was derived in chronically stable individuals and may be completely misapplied when we apply it to the care of the intensive care patient. So, in this situation is even further compounded by the fact that we use a lot of renal replacement therapies in the intensive care unit, and as a consequence, it is not just the GFR of the patient, but also the way in which these specific therapies handle these antibiotics that is relevant, and ultimately a knowledge of this is also important in the appropriate dosing of the antibiotics. Liver function plays a very minor role, but probably the extent of hypoalbuminemia and the possibility of binding of the drugs may be the only influence that needs to be given some consideration when you're using antibiotics in the ICU. More importantly, the pharmacodynamics or the interaction of these antibiotics with the bacteria itself are probably relevant. And in this situation, we need a basic knowledge of the MIC and the minimum bactericidal concentrations are very important. We need to recognize that even when the drug levels come below the MIC, under certain circumstances, there is an ongoing post-antibiotic effect which needs to be under serious consideration. Again, with a limitation in the time in this process, I will not go through each one of these details, but broadly imply that we can look at antibiotics that can be divided into two classic broad categories. What we might consider the concentration dependent antibiotics, in which a high peak dose is probably relevant because many of these infections will have a continuing post-antibiotic effect, and even if the levels come below the MIC, there will be a persistent bactericidal activity that will continue. And as a consequence, such drugs will need to be given in high doses at very infrequent intervals. And typical of these would be the quinolones, the aminoglycosides, and amphotericin, which seems to be functioning in this kind of a concentration dependent way. And the second, this is an example of this, where for a long time we used to give colistin in a very low dose, but we recognize that on the basis of this kind of modeling, that the initial dose of about 9 million units, in contrast to the traditional standard dose of 4.5 million, would be adequate enough. And with this, we have a better clearance rate than you would see under other circumstances. Time-dependent killing is another mechanism where the persistence of the antibiotic concentration above the MIC is very relevant. And the longer it stays above the MIC, the greater the efficacy of the antibiotic. And this is very classical of the beta-lactams, and under these circumstances, the dosing of these beta-lactams is preferably given as a continuous infusion to be more effective, and the duration of time over the MIC is what is relevant for the bactericidal kill. Here again is a small amount of data on the efficacy of a carbapenem, where a continuous infusion of a carbapenem is associated with better clearance of the organisms in contrast to intermittent bolus dosing. So with this basic understanding of the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, there are certainly big advantages in the fact that you can dose your antibiotic more appropriately, and it also gives us a better understanding of the way in which antibiotic levels can be interpreted, and the population studies will give us a better identification of MIC end breakpoints, and ultimately will translate into a better outcome in terms of minimizing the emergence of resistance when we continue to use these antibiotics. To us in the ICU, one very important component of restricting the abuse of the antibiotic is to learn to limit its use to the minimum duration that is necessary for achieving efficacy of these antibiotics. And in this, the landmark paper that came in JAMA in 2003 in VAP seemed to imply that a short duration course of roughly 8 days was as effective as a 15-day course of antibiotics in patients with ventilator-associated pneumonia. But this has to be taken with a certain caveat. Very, very clearly, if there were gram-negative, resistant gram-negatives, and classically what you're talking about is the non-fermenters, Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter, Stenotrophomonas, for instance, under those circumstances, if we gave the briefer period of antibiotic therapy, there was a greater tendency for recurrence of the gram-negative infection. So this kind of a limitation of the duration of therapy seems to be logical, but is completely based on the overall population, that individualization of the duration of therapy would be a little bit more logical. And for that, there is current evidence to suggest that the use of the standard biomarker procalcitonin has got a definitive value. In the PRORATA trial that looked at intensive care patients, a sequential observation of the procalcitonin levels allowed an earlier discontinuation of antibiotics without a significant increase in terms of survival changes. And as a consequence, this would be a great way to minimize the use of antibiotics and will allow the minimization of the emergence of resistance under the circumstances of its use in the ICU. The last issue that I want to deal with in the course of this lecture is the issue related to preserving these antibiotics by minimizing the development of resistance. It is extremely likely that when we have multiple antibiotics that the organism is sensitive to, we would be, we would think it is logical for us to limit the antibiotics to a specific group for a specific time, so that when the emergence of resistance occurs with one specific group, we could use another antibiotic and then a third. So for instance, if I had an organism that is sensitive to, say, 3 different groups of antibiotics, I'm calling it gorillamycin, supersporin, and king congopenem, under these circumstances, I could use it in different ways. I could use a restrictive policy by which I decide that I will use only one of these antibiotics and limit the use of the other 2. I could go through another process by which I would do a cycling of the antibiotics, where I would give one antibiotic for a certain duration of time, alternate it with a second, and then subsequently with a third, and cycle back to the first over a period of time. Or I could take another approach and say, all of this doesn't matter, I will use any one of these antibiotics in a heterogeneous kind of fashion. Now we need to understand whether any one of these processes will restrict the emergence of serious resistance. And the logic used to be that if we cycled an antibiotic, the duration of time during which we didn't administer the antibiotic would be associated with a reduction in the resistance among the organisms. This is a little bit of a misperception, because there is no advantage for the antibiotic, in the absence of an antibiotic, for an organism to come down in terms of its concentration. That is, in other words, there is no fitness cost to the development of an antibiotic resistance. So as a consequence, it is, unless we have evidence about the value of cycling, it is not very logical for us to go ahead with this kind of a process. Do we have evidence? Unfortunately, it is very difficult, and the initial data, at least till 2005, was really very limited, including the Cochrane study, which seems to suggest that we do not have hard enough evidence. So at that point, we started worrying about whether the process of cycling itself was inappropriate, because we can look at it in a very different way, that when there is no antibiotic being given, it need not be associated with a progressive reduction in the rates of resistance, but it only will ultimately slow the process. So there is a need for a better understanding, and this has been demonstrated by mathematical models which seem very clearly to suggest that cycling an antibiotic is probably an inappropriate way of limiting the development of resistance. It seems, on the other hand, far more important to continuously use it in a heterogeneous fashion, and as was demonstrated in at least one large randomized controlled trial of these three processes over a period of time, they showed very clearly that a process of cycling is associated with serious problems with the antibiotic resistance, and a heterogeneous use of all antibiotics simultaneously is the best way in which resistance can be prevented. We have to recognize that when we are using antibiotics, it is a very serious problem. Antibiotics are clearly a resource that is non-renewable. The moment we develop resistance with an antibiotic, we cannot continue to use it. And with this recognition, if we use our antibiotics appropriately, using all the rules that we have developed about its use that I have mentioned up to this point in time, we can probably minimize the emergence of resistance and guarantee that our outcomes are going to be better over the period of time. Thank you very much.